Welcome back to the SDG Business Forum. I'm Maggie Lake. I hope you are enjoying this interactive experience here on our Uniting Business Live platform. I also hope you're tweeting about your resilient rebuild experience here today using the hashtags SDGBiz and Uniting Business. Now, business leaders working in partnership with governments and civil society groups have played an outsized role in shaping the COVID-19 response. As we look to the recovery and rebuild, there is a clear economic imperative for leaders in the private sector to advocate and act on behalf of a resilient and sustainable future. Our next session will explore new and existing initiatives to stabilize and reboot the economy and what actions are needed from all stakeholders to accelerate progress on this critical agenda. This next session will be moderated by Paul Pullman, Vice Chair of the UN Global Compact, Honorary Chair of the International Chamber of Commerce, and the co-founder of Imagine. But before we go to Paul for that discussion, let's hear from the third co-host of the SDG Business Forum, Mr. John Denton, Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce.
Friends, greetings. COVID-19 has had devastating impacts on the economy. And the reality is that without concerted action in the coming months, the pandemic will have lasting implications for business and economic opportunity the world over. In June, the ILO estimated that the equivalent of 655 million full-time jobs were lost worldwide in the first half of 2020, with this burden falling disproportionately on those segments of society for whom the 2030 agenda is squarely intended to offer a brighter future. Women make up only 39% of global employment but account for 54% of overall job losses. And the gender poverty gap is now projected to widen by 2030. Since January, 42% of working young people have experienced declines in income, and current students are now projected to lose $10 trillion in earnings over their working lives. Travel and movement restrictions continue to ease, but the estimated US dollar 1.2 trillion loss in export revenues from international tourism alone will directly or indirectly impact the livelihoods of up to 90% of the working population in tourism-dependent countries, particularly in small island developing states. That's just on 200 million jobs lost. Though reliable data is hard to obtain, the livelihoods of workers operating in the informal economy, as well as refugees and migrants, are thought to have been even more deeply affected by the economic impacts of this pandemic. Behind these statistics lie genuine human suffering of the very kind we committed to eliminate in adopting the SDGs at the United Nations only 5 years ago. If we are to be true to the core tenet of that commitment, to leave no one behind, then it is vital that we chart a concerted way forward to help businesses weather the crisis and enable the private sector to drive a recovery that embeds resilience at its very heart. In this context, and to paraphrase President John F. Kennedy, ask not what business can do for you, but how we can all work together to enable business to ensure economic opportunity and prosperity for all, the actual purpose of the ICC. In the short term, or for as long as this pandemic continues to cast a cloud over the global economy, we see a vital need for sustained stimulus measures to avoid widespread business failures, particularly amongst MSMEs, the smallest of them all. In this context, a comprehensive global agreement is essential to ensure that all governments have the necessary fiscal space to help local businesses weather the effects of this pandemic. At a minimum, this must include a new package of debt relief measures for all nations in need, commensurate in scale and scope to the gravity of the COVID-19 crisis. Together with the new issuance of IMF special drawing rights to provide emerging market governments with the necessary liquidity to protect lives and livelihoods in face of this pandemic. Absent such a coordinated approach, we see a real risk of a further downward spiral in the global economy, particularly if the precarious fiscal position of emerging market sovereigns starts to limit the supply of essential finance to local businesses. Friends, recent signs of volatility in the trade finance market could well be the canary in the coal mine in this regard, shaping the contours of a new crisis. Our message to G20 leaders is clear. Now is the time to do whatever it takes to secure the viability of businesses that provide the foundations of the global economy. And that must start with an internationally coordinated effort to provide governance with the means to mitigate the human and economic toll of this pandemic. Fail, and we will all face the consequences for generations to come. This is, to be sure, not a call for the private sector to get a free pass and for the world to return to business as usual. We know that in the wake of this crisis, it is only right that there will be rising calls for government and business to form a new social contract or a new citizens' bargain. And at the heart of this will be an inevitable expectation that the private sector plays an even greater role in driving economic opportunity, social inclusion, and environmental protection, because you trust the private sector and business leaders. The question is how to enable this shift at real transformational scale and pace. On the one hand, this should be a no-brainer. After all, research has shown that companies that embrace sustainability have lower operating costs, often have higher share prices, and are generally more profitable. Moreover, in the context of COVID-19, companies with established commitments to sustainability seem to have proved better positioned to survive the crisis. They have stronger and greater resilience. But while the long-term business case is clear, the upfront investment needed to position a company for long-term resilience is still out of reach for many businesses. To take just one example, in emerging economies, SMEs suffer from an annual financing shortfall exceeding $2 trillion, leaving nearly 70% of them unserved or underserved by the financial sector. That's why we see a need for genuine systems change involving all actors to provide a basis for a resilient rebuild from COVID-19 and achievement of the SDGs. Most fundamentally, it is imperative that governments create regulatory environments which reward and enable long-term investments in resilience and sustainability, in particular by ensuring the financial system rewards companies that take action to enable themselves to become more sustainable. Sustainability, education, and insights must also be made accessible in every community, in every language, and in every format, so that everyone everywhere can play their part in this effort. We can no longer allow artificial divides, be they digital, based on ability or gender or age or sector or otherwise, to limit the innovation necessary to secure our future, our mutual future. And we must eliminate the false dichotomy of purpose and profit to ensure that our public and private institutions are fit to address the interconnected challenges which we will inevitably face in a post-pandemic world. Together with our global network, we, the ICC, are deeply committed to driving this agenda from the front lines. In this context, I'm delighted to announce the launch of a major new initiative today. With the support of the Exponential Roadmap, with We Mean Business, the United Nations Framework Convention, and pulling on the historic ICC Chambers Action Coalition, we aim to embed climate action in the local business recovery from COVID-19. The SME Climate Hub, which I announced today, will work with a broad coalition of partners to provide small business with the practical tools and incentives needed to allow them to reap the benefit of taking action aligned with the Paris Agreement and the latest climate science. Our aim is to provide a global one-stop shop where MSMEs and SMEs can make an internationally recognized climate commitment, access tailored tools to help them reduce emissions and overhead, and take advantage of incentives and opportunities provided by governments, major businesses, and financial institutions. This joint effort will enable governments to achieve their nationally determined contributions to fighting climate change, as well as helping multinationals reduce emissions in their value chains. Most fundamentally, it will allow hard-pressed SMEs and micro-SMEs to be more competitive today while enhancing their resilience for years to come. We encourage you to find out more about the SME Climate Hub via the ICC website and to join this collective effort to build a holistic system capable of enabling MSMEs to build back better. In conclusion, it is clear that the road ahead for business is clearly uncertain, but the choices we make today and in the coming months will ultimately define the shape of any future rebuild from the ravages of COVID-19. Through our ongoing collaboration with the World Health Organization, the UN Development Programme, UNICEF, UNHCR, and the UN's Regional Economic Commissions, we remain more committed than ever to leveraging our unique global network of 45 million businesses in every jurisdiction, in every sector of every size, to enable businesses to secure peace, prosperity, and opportunity for all. That is our purpose. And we hope that all participants in this year's SDG Business Forum will join us in meeting this vision. Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this session in the SDG Business Forum, a very energizing and very productive day. And I hope wherever you are in the world that you're not zoomed out yet. Very good to hear John Denton as a former chairman of the ICC. It's a pleasure to see him make the announcement on the SME Climate Hub. Very important, with most of the world's economy being done by SMEs, that they also play their role and can play their role in climate action. This year, 5 years after the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals and the start of the decade of action, it has presented a new set of unforeseen challenges. The social and economic cost of COVID-19 pandemic have been exacerbated in many countries by environmental stresses and social unrest. As companies struggle to maintain their footing in this COVID world, some commentators have suggested that the outlook for the economy may have a chilling effect on the adoption of sustainable business practices. Frankly, I believe it's the contrary. A new form of leaders has emerged in this crisis, a generation of executives and rising professionals who understand that there are no successful businesses in a failed world. In this context, the private sector, more than anything, but in partnership in places around the world with governments and civil society leaders, is leveraging the frameworks of the Sustainable Development Goals to respond to the immediate threats in their communities, prepare for long-term sustainability, and put the remedies in place around the key fragilities that have been exposed in 2020. And they are, not surprisingly, climate change, nature loss, social inequality on the other hand, and then increasingly the economic exclusion, which also has a racial dimension to it. Now, the largest and most representative organization in the UN with business is the UN Global Compact, which I have the honor to be the vice chair of. And together with UN DESA and the ICC, as you have seen with John Denton, we have this opportunity to get together and to hopefully become the positive agents of change that we need to galvanize this new economy that we all desire or aspire to have. This session is called The Business Case for a Resilient Rebuild. And the business leaders are working in partnerships with these other parties like government and civil society to indeed rebuild better. And as we look at the recovery and at the way we rebuild, there is a clear economic imperative for leaders in the private sector to advocate and act on behalf of this resilient future. With this insight, corporations are driving investments towards projects that align with the Sustainable Development Goals and are engineered to be fit for purpose for the long term. This session will exploit some exciting new opportunities that some of our leaders are being part of. And I'm joined by some great leaders today. The first one is Emmanuel Faber. Doesn't need an introduction, but he is the CEO of Danone, one of the leading companies in the world now as it comes to implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. A B-team leader and one of the first to put purpose squarely into his company's mission. Welcome, Emmanuel. We also have Veronica de la Serna. So Veronica is the chief executive of Triciclos. Everybody knows Gonzalez as one of the climate champions who actually also worked at Triciclos. They were the first B corporation in Latin America and an absolute delight to work with and an engine for moving us into the recycling or regenerative economy. And we'll be talking about that later. And last but not least, one of the major business people from Africa. We are a pleasure to be joined by Oscar Oyema, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Nigerian Stock Exchange. And he's involved in many of the areas that help us transform the financial markets. Let's dive straight into it. Emmanuel, if I may start with you, what has changed in your business as a result of the COVID crisis? And what are some of the things you had to immediately adjust?
Thank you, Paul, and thanks for the warm welcome. Good to see you here. Thank you so much for having me. Well, I think the immediate effect of the COVID pandemic was that people did not take eating and drinking for granted anymore. Suddenly, there was the scare and the fear of missing. And that radically changed the idea that this industry has been working for decades about just in time, and suddenly people were thinking just in case. That made, I think, a big change. Immediately, we had to obviously respond to the crisis, the sanitary situation of our employees, but also their social and economic stability. We guaranteed incomes and jobs for the 100,000 of all of us around the world for 3 months. Just to make sure that people would feel safe and be at work, responding to the needs of the populations. But the thing was about the resilient rebuild was that one thing that did not change and that accelerated for us was the sustainability topic, and in particular climate. We just announced before the pandemic became a pandemic that we had reached our full scope carbon emission peak in 2019. We published our first post-carbon EPS number in February 26. And for me, it's very clear that carbon sinking by agriculture must be absolute part of the resilient rebuild. So that's one of the aspects, and many of them that we can discuss, on which we didn't change the plan. We actually accelerated the plan, because at the end of the day, that will be the resilience of our agriculture and therefore of the food system.
So one of the things, Emmanuel, and you've been a leader in that, is to say, hey, we need a different form of governance and the way we run companies, away from this myopic focus on shareholder primacy and moving to multiple stakeholders if we want to solve these worldly issues. You were one of the first, or you were the first company in France that got the statue from your shareholders, by the way, of an entreprise à mission, a purpose-driven company. Tell us about that. Why did you lead this? And what has been the effect on Danone?
Yes, well, I think we've been pursuing a B Corp certification for already 5 years. So the journey about making sure that we certify as a responsible company and responsible brands is clearly one of the core 9 goals of Danone, which is aligned with the SDGs. But we decided to go even beyond, because one thing that changed with the pandemic is that suddenly it was obvious that there were so many more powerful stakeholders in the business, just preventing us from, farming, from producing, from buying. And there were governments, local municipalities, NGOs, sanitary measures, trade wars, all of that became very clear as being much bigger stakeholders. And either we were going to stay on the old model, and therefore, as you said, just focus on shareholders' value, or we would agree that it was now time, if we wanted to respond from a strategic basis to this crisis, that we needed a stakeholders approach. So what we did was embed the mission of Danone and our positive impact on health, the planet's resources, building the future with our teams, and inclusiveness of our growth in the DNA of the company, the constitution, the bylaws. And for that, we needed the support of our shareholders, which we got in about 2 months. And when we went through the AGM in June, we had 99% of shareholders that voted for that change. And that's it makes a complete difference if suddenly you have that DNA that flows into the vein of the company, because managers are not going to do sustainability on top of the business. They are going to put sustainability and the purpose at the very core of the business. And that's a change that in a way doesn't change anything, but it changed everything in terms of the energy and the consistency of what we can do.
No, you should be congratulated for taking that leadership and to some extent that risk. But the fact that you got 99% of the shareholder approval, Oscar, does that surprise you? You've been your whole life in the financial world. Shouldn't Emmanuel be single-mindedly focused on the shareholder? And as a leader in the stock exchange in Nigeria, what can we do to move the financial market in the direction that Emmanuel is advocating for?
Thank you, Paul, and let me thank all the organizers for having me join this discussion today. Very important discussion. I do agree with what has been said. It's critical that we view business as being part of an ecosystem. And we have to take from the ecosystem, but we must give back into that ecosystem. And COVID-19 has just made that reality very clear to all of us. As you said, Paul, no business can survive when the world is dead. So we must put sustainability in the heart of everything that we do. And for us at the Nigerian Stock Exchange, that meant really unlocking all of the technology investments we had made leading up to COVID, such that we went from a floor-based trading platform to fully virtual with the flip of a switch with no hiccup. And that provided for businesses to continue to be listed and traded on the floor, for them to raise new capital to deal with the issues that COVID-19 raised, for investors to continue to be able to express themselves, and for market intermediaries to engage with the exchange in a fully virtual way. And so having sustainability in the middle and in the heart of what we do is critical. We wouldn't have been able to do that if we had not made all the investments upfront before COVID-19 hit. One other thing that became immediately apparent to us is that while we had a robust business continuity plan, COVID-19 and the pandemic just made it clear that it wasn't robust enough. Because in order for you to keep in business, it takes not only you, it takes the government and all the various stakeholders and your entire supply chain working together to keep producing the products or the services that we're in business for. So that was very clear and apparent to us.
Yeah, we have seen, Oscar, actually in the emerging markets, a higher awareness of climate change because people are suffering more and seeing the effects of them more, and actually demanding from their companies faster action than we actually see in Europe or the US, regretfully. Although it's high in Europe and the US, emerging markets is even higher. Are you thinking of using the exchange and listing requirements to drive into the direction that Emmanuel is saying and creating the same sort of a social mission status or special trading facilities for companies that are going to be more responsible in this transition?
We are actually already doing that. If you look at our efforts around corporate governance, around sustainability reporting, that is actually mandatory for companies on our premium board. We engaged with the government to work around the framework for green bonds, and now we're looking at social bonds because we realized that, like I mentioned earlier, the entire ecosystem needs to work in a way that facilitates doing business in a sustainable way. And that helps to drive even climate change matters, right? So we realized earlier on that if you're going to grow and have an opportunity to catch up and come into the fourth industrial revolution, we have to do it in a way that is climate friendly. And most of the businesses that are succeeding today that we hear about are companies that have found really innovative ways to address that issue, those big life issues, in a way that continues to preserve the earth.
Yeah, that's encouraging to hear, Oscar, because what the pandemic has shown us that companies that are run multi-stakeholder longer term, taking ESG into account, just like you see from the financial market, the companies themselves, and Emmanuel's company is a great example, are actually doing better. I think that is now becoming increasingly clear. One of those great companies, and the first B Corp, is the one that Veronica is leading, 3Ciclos. And my question to Veronica is very simply, are we pushing water uphill? Earth's Overshoot Day was August 22nd this year. After that, as far as I'm concerned, we're stealing from our children. And we're still talking about recycling. Is that enough? Or do we need to go, as Emmanuel is saying, to a more regenerative way of thinking? And if so, what does that look like?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for the invitation. And I'm very happy to be part of this panel. And yes, the answer is yes. We need to move faster. We need to step away from the classical view of, oh, I'm recycling and this is good. We need to go much further, and we are seeing, thankfully, some commitments in big corporations regarding regeneration, right? You mentioned that word, and it's very important. How can we move away from creating less negative impact and creating positive value, right? To move forward, to actually be able to create the changes needed to build a society that is good for all of us in all the different ways. We in 3Ciclos are a big corporations since practically our beginning, and we've seen how that did play a role in how we confronted this crisis. We were very aware of our interdependence with other stakeholders, the way that we needed to, as Emmanuel said, to secure the income, for example, in our case, to waste pickers. So waste pickers, imagine waste pickers in a lockdown situation, no income at all. And so we needed to secure some income for them. And also we engage with other businesses in different types of projects in order to help them raise funds to support them financially during this crisis. At the same time, since we had very good partnerships with our clients and with our suppliers, we see our clients as partners. We don't see them in a transactional way. And that helped us a lot. We are an SME, we work in recycling. We had to close all of our stations where we received the materials. A lot of companies were like freezing out budgets, so not necessarily a lot of business going on. But we had like very important clients that support us. And thanks to them, we actually managed to go through this crisis without having, the potential huge impact financially wise that we could have had. So that is also very important. We are probably one of the examples that being aware of your interdependence is actually good for confronting this type of moment. So it's very important that.
Yeah, you're practicing the multi-stakeholder model, and it's making you more robust during the crisis. Thanks for sharing that. A question. Sometimes I don't know where my mind goes, but we are using more plastic during COVID. Everything is now plastic, and that seems to be a good thing. I watch television and I see that a lot of governments are cheating us by saying it's going to be recycled, and it doesn't end up being recycled. Then I see a lot of the fossil fuel companies justifying staying in fossil fuel by going downstream in the supply chain and all becoming plastic producers. Are we solving the issue of plastics, or what is needed to solve it? What does truly regenerative mean when we get to these overuses of our scarce resources?
Totally. So maybe we can talk segment the answer in two parts. So we are having some alliances, important alliances regarding plastic. So we, as Triciclos, have moved along with these plastic pacts going along in different parts of the world. We work with different parts of the value chain of plastics, right? Because you need to have a systemic view of it. And we need to move away from just this recycling view. It's hard to manage. It's not necessarily efficient, and it has an environmental impact in its own process. So we need to go upstream. As Triciclos, we've always said, we need to go to the designing process of things. And there is where regenerative enters. So we need to, when you design something, when you design a product, a packaging, whatever solution you're putting in the market, you need to understand what are the implications that solution is going to create further the actual need that is supposedly solving. I don't know if I make myself clear, but
no, 100%.
So in the design process, you're deciding whether, this thing that I'm putting in the market is something that then I will have to, take care of in a very inefficient way and hard way, or can I design it in a way that actually creates value? In the plastic area, you could have actually regeneration through plastics, right? Like compostable plastics that can actually create an atmosphere, an environment that actually then creates more life or more things. But also, I would say that you should innovate drastically in business models. So the way that we consume, how we pass from consumers to users, instead of actually needing to own everything that we buy, and maybe do it in a different way, in being, and with that being more respectful for the environment as a whole.
So instead of dealing with the problems, design it right from the start, and innovation, a big part of that. Agriculture, natural services, over 125 trillion. Business has potentially a threat of 44 trillion, according to the World Economic Forum, in the destruction of natural services. They don't seem to pay for it. Many don't seem to care. But here is a man, Emmanuel, thinking about regenerative agriculture. What does that mean, Emmanuel? And what do we need to do to move the whole market of food, if you want to, or the food value chain, to a positive contribution to solving climate change versus right now being part of the problem?
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. Agriculture in total has a net impact on greenhouse gas emissions, which is equivalent to the whole of industry. And no one is speaking about it because conceptually it looks much more difficult to go and find farmers in the field that speak to some large industries and try to rein in them with incentives. Yet it's very clear that agriculture has something absolutely magic that no one else has. It can put the carbon back into the soil where it's coming from. And you cannot put the carbon back into the oil pit that you have extracted to start with. So unlike industry, we agricultural-based companies and businesses can actually put that carbon back into the soil. And it's not about externalities. It's really about the resilience of the rebuild. Because what has happened is that carbon was taken away from the soil by monocropping and tillage that extracted that carbon and that continues to extract that carbon. The day you stop doing this and you turn into regenerative practices that do not focus on the power of the plant itself, inventing new plants that would be super powerful and do magic things, you focus on the health of soil and you put carbon back, which is about 60% of the total nutrients in the soil, the organic matter for the plants. And then you're able to rebuild the soils, which today are anywhere between 30 and 70% degraded around the world because of that overcropping, over monocropping of powerful plants. So by doing this, you actually restore the ability for food to continue to exist for the next generation to farm. And in the same time, you're sinking carbon back into. And therefore, the one thing that needs to happen is that, one, governments need to stop supplying subsidies for chemical entrants, fertilizers, pesticides, etc., that are killing biodiversity and are not taking care of the CO2 emissions. And they should focus on incentives for the farmers to sink carbon. One obvious thing for me is the fact that farmers should be able to monetize their carbon positive practices exactly the same way as there is a Kyoto Protocol for emissions by heavy industries in the air. So that really starts with that. And the second thing about regenerative agriculture is rebuilding the biodiversity that we cultivate. We are relying as a species, human species, 75% of our calories come from 6 plants around the world. It's totally crazy. If there is a problem with one of those, there is a problem everywhere. So we need to make sure that we rebuild the biodiversity in the fields. And that's the reason why, with a number of other companies, we've launched One Planet Business for Biodiversity Coalition exactly a year ago in the UNGA, because we want to commit to make sure that we diversify the seeds, the ingredients that we are engineering in the farms that we are using the products from.
Yeah, no, thank you. And what is very energizing is we can turn agriculture into a solution in carbon capture,
Absolutely.
Natural solution, probably very effective in terms of investment and return. And we can give the smallholder farmer a better livelihood. Often that's
Yes.
where we find the poor. That's what you're saying. You're also part of a great coalition of 560 companies with over $4 trillion of turnover that is calling on governments to include and take action on more nature-based solutions. We want to thank you for that. Oscar, if we listen to all of this, from plastics, from the agriculture, are we measuring the wrong things? Should we start measuring different things? And what can the financial market do to value these natural, if you want to, the environmental and social capital that we've been talking about just until now?
Paul, I would not say that we're measuring the wrong things. I would say when we're not capturing everything that we need to measure.
Right.
So in the financial markets, we're measuring financial performance, but increasingly, we're also measuring the value that companies are creating and bringing into the marketplace. And we do that using sustainability reporting so that you can see from an ESG perspective what companies are doing to better the state of the human being and the state of the earth. So we need to do a lot more. And there's changes being at the intersection of various stakeholders, intermediaries, regulation, policy, investors, issuers, have a role to play in creating standards that encourage companies to move towards the direction of doing full integrated reporting and not just financial reporting. We believe that in doing that, companies are actually going to be able to focus and sharpen their focus on providing value added to the state of the human being and not just financials that are submitted to the exchange on a quarterly basis.
Peter Bakker often says he's leading the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and he is always saying accountants will change the world. Unless we start measuring more than financial capital, we won't get there. There's now a great initiative with the WEF as well by the 4 big accounting firms to hopefully come with some standards and then working with IFRS and others to have a common position. So I hope that the exchanges will be an active part of that. What is the most exciting initiative you've seen in that area have you been involved in?
Well, I think that from our perspective, given what COVID-19 has thrown up, is the whole area of social bonds and companies raising money in the capital markets to better be able to address the challenges of the pandemic. Yes, we saw companies use traditional methods like issuance of additional shares and things like that, rights and the rest. But we also saw new ways of raising capital that are really targeted at addressing COVID-19. So I think that is very exciting. One other thing that we did and we noticed was working with partners to try to build capacity around understanding the various ways that you can raise money, funds in a socially responsible way to address challenges that have an ESG component to them. So in the last 2 years, for example, we've helped companies raise about 50 billion naira in ESG compliant funding plus green bonds. So we intend to do more of that, and we see that happening across the world. We know that the Africa Development Bank raised its own COVID-19 related funding and listed on the London Stock Exchange. We know that our partners at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange did a lot of blue, green, and social bonds during this COVID-19 pandemic to help companies meet their financial objectives. And so we think we're going to see a lot more of that.
I was very encouraged, and you're right, the trend is our friend. We just need to accelerate it. Very encouraged to see today an SDG bond attacking inequality. I don't know if you read that in Julian Tett's FT moral column. And so it's moving in the right direction, in the financial market, as we've seen in COVID, starts to appreciate and value companies that also take care of the S, the social part. Emmanuel, you've been a champion with the One Planet Lab on business for inclusive growth, very much focused on addressing inequality. Say a few words around that and how other companies can get into that. And then I want to ask Veronica the same for Latin America. How do we solve that issue?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Maybe one additional example I'd like to bring to what Oscar said about the way financial markets are looking at these sustainability topics. We have been able to refinance a 2 billion bank credit syndicated loan 18 months ago with 12 of the largest banks in the world, where the interest rate is going to decline over time as the company is going to meet ESG metrics, one of them being the certification of our subsidiaries as B Corps. So it's very interesting because becoming a B Corp is actually going to reduce the financial charges that we pay. And of course, these guys are not ideologues. They are doing this because they see B Corps in the current environment as being either a provider of alpha, as finance people would say, or lowering the beta of the company. So, before it comes to the equity, maybe it's a different story, but debt is already there. And I think it's very promising. To your point about business for inclusive growth, that's part of this notion that there will not be market economy for the long term if there is not both social and climate justice. It will not stick. It will go away. And I think, unfortunately, many of the things that we are looking at today, politically around the world, are showing that. And so the idea was during the G7 that was organized by the French presidency that we would launch an initiative where the idea of inclusive growth would be part of the narrative of the G7 that took place a year ago in Biarritz. And Paul, you've been part of this, and thank you for your support and leadership on that as well. So in essence, we have now about 40 companies, multi-trillion sales, and millions of employees around the world that have pledged to work on their own diversity, inclusiveness in the workplace, but also in the supply chains, providing that the support as a platform of ILO. So it's one place where CEOs of large companies can speak directly, frankly, honestly, with trade unions at the global level, but also working on the metrics, as Oscar and yourself have been discussing, with OECD as a knowledge partner, because we all recognize that GDP is a practical thing, but it does not summarize what we need. And in particular, if you think about GDP per cap, going back probably 10 or 15 years in many countries, the question will be, to avoid the crisis and rethinking about a resilient rebuild, what is it that we should take to take from 20,000 maybe, or 2 or 5, if we want to avoid that 2020 crisis? What is the other path that we need to take? And it cannot be driven only by GDP per cap growth back. So we believe that inclusiveness is going to be a fundamental part of the resilience. And this is why also with these companies and the metrics of OECD, we want to be able at G20 and G7 levels and cycles to inform public policy in order to create a more inclusive level of growth and kind of growth than the one we've seen for the last 50 years.
Yeah. And absolutely needed. I was just reading some numbers yesterday that the top 500 people in the world now have a combined wealth of 6.6 trillion. And only 4 people, 500 billion. And here comes the killer statistic. Since COVID, the combined wealth of that group has gone up by 765 billion. I don't think that's the case for the majority of the people in the world. And then on top, you read today that this 1% of the population has the carbon emission that's actually bigger than the other 50%. So how is Latin America solving this? Veronica.
We're on our way, a bit farther away, and it's a huge issue because also COVID will bring more poverty, more inequality, more informality. We are countries that need, right, much more regulation still, much more businesses to think of their impact in a different way. So, I mean, I don't want to repeat what Emmanuel was saying. I just wanted to complement by but saying that as a business, we all need to reflect on our own practices and the way that we can be change makers. So I don't know, gender equality. How can we take a look inside our business models and our teams in order to promote a real gender equality? After COVID is going to be a huge deal. I mean, in countries where we operate, Chile, Brazil, Colombia, having to work from home for women has been a tremendous challenge. So how can we, as companies, not leaving aside regulation, leaving aside what it's actually you're actually need to comply, but how can we play an active role in this and a lot of other issues? And what we use is the SDG Action Manager, actually. So we, as a B Corp, we measure ourselves through the B Impact Assessment, and now we're using the SDG Action Manager because there you can find a very easy, quick wins, let's say, that could eventually create a huge difference in this and all the other SDGs that are so relevant right now.
Yeah, 2 things you mentioned, Veronica, and thanks for bringing that up. The SDG Action Manager is developed together with the B Corp movement and the UN Global Compact and is for free available to anybody to get going. There's also another thing is making global goals local business, which is a very simple tool to integrate the Sustainable Development Goals. Your point on gender is so valid. There's 34% of the workforce, as we measure it, is women, but they have been 60% of the people that lost their jobs due to COVID have been women. And it's interesting, again, once more, when we have more women in government or representing us, or more women working on peace agreements and other things, we tend to be in a better spot. One of the things that COVID has shown us, that the countries that were led by women seem to have dealt with it better than some of the countries slightly north of you that have, frankly, or to the east of you that have made a mess out of it. What does social equality mean as we move forward for each of you? If you can give a 30-second answer, what does social inclusion or equality mean for you? Emmanuel, you want to kick it off?
That's a huge question. I think it's really a matter of rebuilding or ensuring that the dreams that we had when the UN were created, the SDGs that we have put forward as a guideline, a compass for the future, are being a reality, because there is so much now that goes against that tide. I think social inclusion is the absolute cement objectives that will ensure that we can live in peace and that we can do business in peace. And so, to me, that's certainly the most critical underlying factor on which we need to act. And I would add what I said earlier. Of course, climate is urgent and super important, but without social inclusion and social justice, climate will not stick. Climate actions will not stick. So that's really a fundamental.
Oscar.
For me, it means viewing humanity from a prism of equal access. So not from a prism of race or gender or religion or any other thing, just equal access for everybody.
Thanks. Veronica?
For me, it's both a goal and an opportunity. So it's a goal. We need to see ourselves as a group of humans that need to, of course, support and foster everyone. But at the same time, it's a tremendous opportunity that probably we're just not looking at on diversity issues and the fact that social, let's say, benefit will create a much creative and supportive economy.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks. We're slightly over time, 5 seconds. Wonderful panel. Thanks for your honest and open discussions. More importantly, thanks for what you're doing. The COVID crisis has shown no healthy people on an unhealthy planet. And the companies that understand that and actively participate, the ESG, the longer-term multi-stakeholder focused companies, are doing better. It has also shown that we can act fast if we have to. Now is the moment for all of us to take that collective responsibility and act fast on climate change, on inequality, and ultimately to assure that we achieve these sustainable development goals in this decade of action, to irreversibly eradicate climate change, doing it in a more sustainable and equitable way, and indeed leaving no one behind. Thank you for being part of this journey. Thank you for your leadership, and hopefully see you soon again.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful panel. Paul, thank you and your guests for that great discussion. Now, our next speaker is no stranger to sustainable investment. Her commitment to gender equality led her to launch the European Union United Nations Spotlight Initiative, which has invested more than $500 million in seed funding towards policies, services, and data interventions which combat instances of violence against women and girls. In the context of the COVID-19 rebuild, she will be leading the European Union's partnership strategy to reduce global poverty and support sustainable development. Please welcome Ms. Jutta Urpilainen, Commissioner of the International Partnerships of the European Union.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, let me first thank the organizers for this important forum. The pandemic has shown the need for strong partnerships. We need to come together to accomplish results, and you know this. This forum is an important reminder that private companies are often the positive agent of change in their local communities and across the world. Private sector is known for its innovative solutions and creating lasting impact. Response to the pandemic must be our joint transformative agenda for a sustainable recovery at global level. This is why Team Europe is mobilizing over 36 billion euros on global fight against COVID-19. This is why President von der Leyen has called for a global recovery initiative linking investment and debt relief to the Sustainable Development Goals. EU has continued to promote a sustainable recovery that is green, digital, just and resilient. It is clear that the private sector will be at the heart of this recovery. There have been strong goals for aligning private finance with the Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement. We know that no amount of public resources will alone be enough. Taking our shared agenda forward, companies can also be more open about their social and environmental impact. This must go hand in hand with government efforts to develop business-friendly environments and fair tax systems. The EU budget and recovery package will mobilize private and public resources over the next decade. Together, we must focus on future, youth, education and women. And again, we will be fighting this struggle with the private sector. This fight against inequalities is a crucial challenge to achieving the SDGs and reaching our objective of leaving no one behind. EU will continue to lead and promote inclusive growth and equality with the SDGs at the centre of economic policy, home and abroad. Inclusive society is strong. It is good for people and business, democracy and market economy. So we look forward to working closely with businesses, governments and internal partners on this shared ambitious agenda. Thank you.
An inclusive society is indeed a strong society. Our thanks to the Commissioner. Now, throughout her career, Ms. Pamela Koch-Hamilton, Director of the Division on International Trade and Commodities at UNCTAD, has worked extensively to strengthen the capacity of the private sector and micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises through investment promotion. She has been appointed by the UN Secretary General to lead the International Trade Center, the agency enabling SMEs to become more competitive and connect to international markets. Please welcome Pamela Koch-Hamilton.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased that one of my first events as incoming Executive Director of the International Trade Center is to engage with you at the SDG Business Forum. I'm grateful to our hosts, the UN Global Compact, International Chamber of Commerce, and the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. I also extend congratulations to the UN Global Compact on their 20-year anniversary. And I look forward to working closer with the Executive Director, Sanda Ojiambo, and her team. We're at a crucial point in time, with 10 years left to implement the global goals, and much of the world still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. As the head of the United Nations Development Agency dedicated to supporting the competitiveness of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, MSMEs, I am convinced that a resilient rebuild needs bold and practical partnership focused on placing small companies at the center of recovery. In the face of today's global health crisis, the socioeconomic fallout has been severe, and we're still counting the costs. Among businesses, MSMEs have been most vulnerable to the global lockdown. ITC's recent survey of 6,000 small business firms found that over 50% of micro and small firms are at risk of permanent closure 6 months into the pandemic. Smaller firms also make up a larger proportion of companies in sectors that have been hardest hit, such as tourism, services, and manufacturing. The impact for many small island developing states has been catastrophic, given the level of dependence on tourism as a share of GDP and FX earnings. The pandemic has exposed a fragile economic context that rests on deep fault lines of inequality. In many places, essential workers are undervalued and overworked, forced to make tough choices between their safety and their livelihoods. Even before COVID-19, we were grappling with forces that were fundamentally shifting the context in which we do business, such as climate change and rapidly changing technology. Today, more than ever, we need bold and innovative leadership to not only recover from the current crisis, but to reimagine and refashion our global economy to be more just, sustainable, inclusive, and resilient. What does such an economy look like? I can think of a few illustrations. An international trading system that allows medical supplies to reach those who need it most. Equitable business practices that reward equal pay for equal work. International value chains that minimize environmental degradation and respect workers' rights. And at its core, strong, innovative, and resilient MSMEs. Why focus on MSMEs? These small firms are the backbone of the economy, making up over 90% of all companies and 60 to 70% of employment. They tend to employ people from the most vulnerable segments of society, including women, youth, migrants, and refugees, and are often led by them. For these populations to do more, just provide income, they allow the people in the most vulnerable circumstances to be their own agents of change and move toward creating economic self-reliance and resilience. Indeed, undertaking recovery efforts with and for MSMEs is not only critical to its success, but also critical to achieving Agenda 2030. ITC has almost 60 years experience providing direct technical support to MSMEs. Large global firms are partners and vital partners to help MSMEs in three main ways: by sharing their expertise and know-how, leveraging their networks and influence, and providing access to markets. Allow me to share some examples. ITC She Trades initiative offers rich examples where large multinational companies purposefully integrate women-led businesses into their value chains, help them meet quality standards, and share specific know-how to help them do business better. As we endeavor to build back better, the private sector is uniquely able to contribute innovative ideas and solutions and to debunk the perception that there are necessarily trade-offs between different SDGs. If we work together to find systems-based solutions, we can and will deliver across multiple goals. I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Koch-Hamilton. Of course, it's difficult to have a frank conversation about investment without addressing debt and equity. Stephanie von Friedeberg is the Chief Operating Officer of the International Finance Corporation and will transition into the role of Interim Chief Executive Officer of the IFC at the end of the month. Please welcome Stephanie von Friedeberg.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor to address this year's forum. Talking about the role of the private sector for a resilient rebuild could not be more timely and lies at the core of what we do at IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. Long before the pandemic, we made great strides in establishing that aligning the private sector with the SDGs is good both for business and for development. The Business and Sustainable Development Commission had found that pursuing sustainable business models could unlock opportunities of at least $12 trillion a year by 2030 and generate up to 380 million jobs. This is more than 8 times the population of Uganda or Kenya. In other words, over the next 10 years, pursuing the SDGs could give a job, meaning an opportunity for a better life, to millions of families in their home countries. Prior to the crisis, we also established that both the need and the opportunity for sustainable investing are particularly high in the poorest countries. In terms of the need, the IMF had established that the scale up in the SDG finance in emerging markets required an average additional annual investment of 4% of GDP. In the case of the low-income developing countries, this average was 15%. In terms of the opportunity, 8 out of 10 people in the world will live in Asia or in Africa by 2100, and 2/3 of all of the middle class spending power will be concentrated in Asia by 2030. Importantly, we had estimated that the potential market for impact investments in emerging markets could be as high as $26 trillion. Finally, with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, we had cemented a strong foundation to mobilize private players to join forces and take concerted action. Today, due to the pandemic, we see a very different picture, rendering our collective work even more urgent as development challenges have deepened. The World Bank estimates that the pandemic may lead to as many as 100 million people falling into poverty. According to the ILO, some 150 million full-time jobs were lost in the first quarter of the year, and millions of other people are set to lose their livelihood in coming months. Now more than ever, we need to persevere and support private businesses. Since March, close to $90 billion of capital has left emerging markets, and $67 billion of equity flows have been lost in the start of the year. At the same time, large amounts of support from donor governments, meaning official development aid, and already limited domestic resources are being diverted to emergency relief and recovery for COVID-19. As Paul Pullman often says, the price of inaction is much larger than the cost of action, especially now when inaction can lead us to the brink of a depression and risks jeopardizing decades of progress for the most vulnerable. So what do we do? How do we build on what we've learned and the progress we have made? And how do we ensure that our response to the COVID will pave the way for a resilient rebuild? At the World Bank Group, we believe in the international development community ought to focus our response in 3 stages: relief, restructure, and rebuild. With relief, we mean focusing on liquidity and keeping companies afloat, especially SMEs. Experience from past shocks, including the recession of 2008, has taught us that this will save jobs, maintain markets, limit the economic damage, and allow faster rebuild. With restructure, we mean working through distressed assets, reallocating where possible, again, to preserve jobs and build back faster. Lastly, with rebuild, we mean putting the private sector at the heart of rebuilding better in a sustainable and resilient way. And this is where the SDGs can serve as our compass. In line with this approach, in the World Bank Group, we are planning to deploy $160 billion by June of 2021, including $47 billion from IFC in the overall support for the private sector. In IFC, we launched early an $8 billion fast-track relief facility, which is providing liquidity to companies and financial institutions. Just recently, we established a $4 billion global health platform to provide financing to manufacturers of healthcare products and help developing countries increase access to critical healthcare supplies to fight the pandemic. And now we are working on restructuring platforms built with a sustainability lens and using sustainability bonds and loans. Let me conclude with 2 simple observations. First, reaching the SDGs is clearly not just good for the poor and for the vulnerable. It is good for business. We must not lose sight of the incredible opportunities for businesses in emerging markets and of the patient capital that is sitting on the sidelines. Second, no one can face this crisis alone. To rebuild better, we need collective action and leadership across the public and private sectors. All actors need to share knowledge, join forces and resources, and stay focused on the long-term solutions. I am now more confident than ever that together we can truly make a difference, especially after all of the passion, commitment, and great ideas that have been shared today. Thank you very much.